There once lived a farmer who grew extraordinary, award-winning wheat. Each year, he would enter the state farmers fair and win a gold award for his premium harvests. The farmer's exceptional crop was praised all around the state. Finally, the success story of his wheat reached the ears of a journalist who wanted to interview the farmer. While learning about the farmer's agricultural process, the journalist discovered that the farmer shared his highest quality seeds with his neighbors. "How can you afford to share your best wheat seeds with your neighbors when some of them compete with you in the agricultural fair?" asked the curious reporter. "Oh, that's simple," said the farmer. "Ensuring the success of my neighbors is required for my own success. The winds here pick up pollen from ripening wheat and swirl it from field to field. If my neighbors grew inferior wheat, cross-pollination would eventually degrade the quality of mine. To grow the highest quality product, I must help my neighbors grow good wheat too." Raised in a religious home, I was taught that certain behavior was good and that other behavior was evil. The ultimate judge of good and evil was God, and I needed to align my behaviors with what God considered to be good to pass the test of life. How I did on this morality test determined my eternal fate, and that was the primary reason I was given to be moral. In the absence of the certainty of God, I still believe that morality plays an important role in our lives and provides benefits regardless of whether we will one day meet our Maker. This perspective comes from observations of the advantages enjoyed by those who followed the moral guidance suggested in the religious community where I was raised. What I previously viewed as blessings from heaven now seem to be the natural consequences of making good moral decisions. Accordingly, my view has shifted away from morality being guidelines to win the favor of God, to being guidelines that encourage behaviors that maximize our well-being. Rather than requiring these guidelines to come from on high, we can generally determine which behaviors we should encourage and discourage based on whether they cause positive or negative consequences. Identifying behaviors with positive and negative consequences is nothing new for human beings. For actions that cause particularly damaging consequences, societies throughout history have created laws to make them illegal. Corresponding punishments have been affixed to these laws that offenders must face when found guilty of violating them. When considering laws, we must keep in mind the tremendous direct and indirect costs to create and enforce them. In many cases, these costs are justified. For example, it would be unsustainable to permit thieves or murderers to take from others and destroy human life without a way to hold them legally accountable. However, like most things, there's a spectrum related to the magnitude of negative consequences associated with various undesirable behaviors. When a behavior has some level of negative consequence, but doesn't justify the cost of legally restricting it, we need something other than laws to keep the behavior in check. Unfortunately, we often view legal versus illegal as the line of demarcation between good and bad. This is simply not the case. There are plenty of behaviors that cause problems in society but would be impractical to legislate against. Legally restricting them generally causes more severe negative consequences than the inherent negative consequences from the behavior itself. A great example of this would be America's attempt at prohibiting alcohol in the 1920s and early 1930s. Irresponsible behavior tied to alcohol causes many issues in society. Alcohol also provides enough social benefits that people are going to drink regardless of whether it's legal or illegal. When it became illegal, the consumption, production, and distribution of alcohol moved from above-board channels to below-ground black markets. Mobs formed that settled their disagreements with guns in the streets because they couldn't be settled with lawyers in courts. Many died from bad batches of liquor made in bathtubs, and the government intentionally added poison at times to discourage people from drinking. Violators of the legal restrictions went to jail for doing trivial things that were previously perfectly acceptable. It was a disaster. The United States government fought diligently to enforce the law, but this enforcement did more damage than the good from legally restricting it. In 1933, alcohol became legal again, despite the continued damage it does in society. Given what we learned during Prohibition, alcohol should be legal despite certain clear, negative consequences associated with it. Making something like this illegal simply ends up doing more harm than it prevents. The history of smoking cigarettes provides additional insights on how damaging behavior can be curtailed without laws prohibiting it. Smoking has never been made entirely illegal in the United States, but its usage dropped significantly as the consequences of using it were more broadly understood. As a group, society began teaching why the behavior was unhealthy. When this was understood by a critical mass of people, social pressure encouraged smokers to quit and prevented new smokers from starting. We shouldn't discount the power of social pressure to prevent behaviors that do damage. Human beings still have herd-like instincts from our earlier ancestors, and in previous generations the inability to fit in with the group was a ticket to isolation and death. The manner in which social pressure ought to be applied is a delicate art. First, individuals must understand which behaviors are discouraged. Next, and even more important, is the responsibility to provide a clear understanding of why a behavior is discouraged. If it's not possible to clearly articulate why a behavior has negative consequences and what those consequences are, then it's likely a behavior that shouldn't be discouraged. Establishing which behaviors should be frowned upon and why is the non-governmental equivalent of passing a law. It's important to note that discouraged behavior is still legal behavior, which means individuals voluntarily choose to avoid it. Given the freedom to choose without legal consequence, we can also voluntarily engage in it. This leads to the final aspect of using social pressure to reduce unwanted behavior: social consequences. After someone does something that's socially discouraged, the group discouraging it must have a mechanism for addressing the person committing the offense. This is the non-governmental equivalent of enforcement of laws. Ideally, the situation is handled through social accountability, a term we'll define in a moment. Unfortunately, these kinds of situations are often dealt with using shame and judgment. Shame and judgment places the focus on the person and not the behavior. It lowers self-esteem, can lead to social withdrawal, and rarely provides motivation for change. While this method has been used throughout history, it is not as effective or helpful as social accountability. Social accountability focuses on the behavior, and the first thing to understand is why the person decided to engage in it. Understanding why helps establish whether there were extenuating circumstances involved. In addition, time should be spent discussing what lessons, if any, were learned from the experience. After establishing a base of understanding, a reminder can be provided of why the behavior was discouraged in the first place. Ultimately, since this is voluntary behavior, the individual has the choice to continue engaging in it if they want to. If it's behavior that the group doesn't want to be associated with, actions may eventually need to be taken to remove the individual from the group. This whole process works best when done within groups of people who care deeply for one another. Casting an individual out should always be the last resort, and care should be taken so that people never feel so badly about themselves that permanent damage is done. The objective should be to provide a feedback loop to guide the individual towards a better path for themselves and to maintain an expected standard of behavior for the group. The effort to provide social accountability is rarely found from strangers. We typically get it from people we socialize with regularly and with whom we share common beliefs. Historically, congregating religious groups have served this purpose well. The downside to finding moral guidelines through these organizations is that the guidelines are often tied to eternal consequences. This means that while moral behavior is technically voluntary, it effectively feels obligatory. Additionally, these organizations sometimes default to teaching that things are either good or bad simply because God said so. This removes the important element of understanding why. Finally, shame and judgment are often present in these organizations and have left many with damaging scars. Regardless of these shortcomings, these organizations fill an important role in society to bring together like-minded individuals who keep undesirable behavior in check through social pressure and without legislation. This positive influence from people you care about generally forces men to be better men and women to be better women. It's not impossible to avoid discouraged behavior in the absence of a group like this, but social accountability among individuals who regularly spend time together and care for one another is a powerful tool to aid in this effort. It's much like the farmer who established a high standard for his wheat by ensuring all his neighbors were using the best possible seeds. In so doing, the farmers collectively created an environment where an outstanding crop could be grown. If we don't belong to a group like this, our tribal natures will still cause us to look for a source that defines encouraged and discouraged behavior. In the global world we currently live in, this can lead to us relying on general media, advertisements, news, and entertainment to create a quasi-community as this source. Unfortunately, the motivation from these organizations is to sell us things, not to maximize our well-being. Knowing that the pleasure centers of our minds are the easiest to appeal to, they often sell by promoting these activities. Once again, these can be good for us in small doses, but bad when engaged in too regularly. As we've discussed previously, when our time spent pursuing leisure or pleasure exceeds our time spent pursuing satisfaction through purpose, we will live suboptimal lives. When the groups who are trying to sell us things become our community for encouraged and discouraged behaviors, we rely on inverted guidance that can have devastating consequences on our well-being. With this in mind, social accountability plays an additional role beyond serving as a mechanism to handle situations after negative behavior is engaged in. Knowing you will be held accountable for your behavior by a group who cares about you allows you to use that as a shield to protect against negative peer pressure. Essentially, it places positive peer pressure in your corner as a defensive tool. Given the allure of things typically associated with negative peer pressure and the desire for most of us to fit in, it's nearly impossible to avoid these behaviors without positive peer pressure on your side. When you have a community behind you that will hold you accountable for your actions, it's much easier to make decisions that are in your best interest. Another nuance to morality is that not all behaviors have only positive or negative consequences. There is a vast middle ground of behaviors that have good-bad consequences. Groups who entirely shun behaviors with elements of both good and bad consequences shield themselves from the bad, but they do so at the expense of the good. As we consider how to optimize living, it would be wrong to completely eliminate behavior that causes both positive and negative consequences. Rather, it's more prudent to find a moderation point where engaging in the behavior produces more good than bad. That moderation point may be different for different people, and some may choose to avoid good-bad things altogether. The freedom to choose is again an important element of this equation. In addition, creating specific rules is generally less helpful than establishing guidelines to shape our behavior. Guidelines allow for greater flexibility to accommodate the differences in people's needs. Much like a freeway where certain drivers travel a little faster than others, moral principles need to allow for personal preferences within certain ranges. Continuing with our driving analogy, most people think of themselves as the only ones going the right speed on the road. If someone is going faster, we think of that person as being reckless. If they are going slower, we think of that person as being intolerably cautious. Neither conclusion is true unless the other person is driving significantly faster or significantly slower than the acceptable speeds. Smaller variations are clearly permissible and align with the other driver's personal preferences. We should be careful in our views of morality to not assume we're the only ones traveling at the right speed. We should allow for ranges of acceptable behavior, love people regardless of where they're at, and discourage behavior only when it falls outside of acceptable ranges. To recap, we have laws to restrict behaviors with the most egregious negative consequences found in society. For behaviors that cause less severe but still negative consequences, non-governmental groups should establish encouraged and discouraged behavior. Positive social pressure can then be used to keep behavior with negative consequences in check. This is best done by groups of people who care about one another, spend time with each other regularly, and typically have shared beliefs. If we look to groups trying to sell us something as a community, we will develop a distorted picture about encouraged behavior and discouraged behavior. Ultimately, people are different, and there should be principles established that offer flexibility in providing guidelines. As we consider the innate unfairness in life, moral behavior is also our most powerful tool to create greater equality. We will never improve equality by delusionally believing the world is something that it's not. We achieve this aim by deeply understanding the truth of our natures and the consequences to our actions. We can then establish agreed-upon standards and enforce them through social accountability. This is how the playing field of life is best leveled. The term leveling correctly implies that those who are naturally more advantaged will feel like they have more to lose by living moral lives. Despite this perception, everyone's well-being benefits from moral living, even if it comes at the expense of other desirable pursuits. Morality can be a pendulum that swings until it goes too far in either direction and rarely stays put where it belongs. Given society's tendency to over and undershoot the proper balance, there should be an expectation that moral guidelines need to be recalibrated over time as we better understand ourselves and the world we live in. Living by moral guidelines should always be voluntary. After all, moral behavior, if properly decided upon, is simply behavior that optimizes well-being in human life. Moral behavior may seem restricting at times, much like how a string can appear to prevent a kite from flying higher. However, the very same restricting force the string provides is what allows the kite to safely remain in the air. Living a moral life allows us to do the same. Surrounding ourselves with others who also want to live moral lives and who will hold us accountable when we don't is the best way to achieve this aim.